With LA Metro's pretty intense cost escalations recently, something has crystallized for me. If we're gonna successfully build anything, we need to change our way of doing things. And yeah, I have a whole video on the complicated morass that is our cost and timelines crisis, and there's even some progress on those points. But meanwhile, there's some low-hanging fruit just waiting to be plucked. See, when we build grade-separated rail in this city, Metro does essentially one thing: dual-bored tunnels with excavated stations multiple stories underground. They set these guidelines in the early to mid-80s, before I was even born, and they're still by and large using them today, with almost no deviation except where strictly necessary. The problem is, this is a very expensive way to dig tunnels, and it's only getting more expensive. Meanwhile, there are two far, far cheaper ways to build grade-separated rail. One, of course, is elevated, which we've occasionally built within dedicated right-of-ways, but can't seem to convince anyone in the city to let us build over streets, a continuing conundrum that I'll continue to discuss. But the other is cut and cover. Cut and cover is just what it sounds like. You dig out a tunnel and you cover it up. This is how basically all original subway lines were built. It creates a much shallower line, sometimes immediately below street level, and is absurdly cheap compared to our current methodology. So why don't we use it? I spoke to experts to get a better sense of things.
There's three factors there. I think there's an institutional bias towards a high technology solution. TBMs are hugely impressive machines, and there's a bias against cut and cover as being the old technology. You get those photos when they were doing like the New York subway where it's chaos, and that isn't modern cut and cover. So there's a historical bias, and there's a lack of appetite of politicians to even broach the idea of disruption.
That politics point is the really big reason. Cut and cover requires closing the streets that you're digging under during construction, at least until it's excavated enough that you can deck over the tunnel and the street can be restored. And that leads to pissed off people. It's also best on lines that entirely or mostly follow streets, as when you go off street, you need to acquire and knock down any structures it passes under to, cut and cover the line. This got me thinking about what current projects in Metro's list could be pushed as good proofs of concept that could finally convince Metro to shift from the old ways and embrace something new, or rather, even older, for the cost savings. And, well, we need to start with the mostly grade-separated projects, so the East San Fernando Valley Line and Southeast Gateway lines are out. The South Bay extension is on its own right-of-way and is already grade-separated cheaply with aerial and overcrossings. The East Side extension, using the chosen route, kind of needs to travel off-street in two areas, and if you're launching a tunnel boring machine or TBM for those parts, you're left with a pretty small part of the route to alter. Sepulveda, of course, should be elevated in the valley with Alternative 4, and that remains an ongoing battle. Vermont Rail? Yeah, actually, that would be perfect for both cut and cover and elevated, north and south of Gage, respectively. Trouble is, this A isn't a Measure M project and thus is wholly unfunded, and B, using one of the least wealthy parts of town as a test case for a slightly more disruptive technology understandably becomes untenable. So, what even remotely near-term projects are left? Well, there is, of course, Crenshaw North. Phase 1 of the K Northern Extension makes sense board because it ideally goes off street grid for a while, saving a lot of time, even though Lafayette Square wants to reverse that. But phases 2 and 3? It seemed crazy at first. There's multiple 90-degree turns that, as designed now, go under a lot of properties off street. Phase 2 begins extremely deep under the D line, and then later has to be able to at least cross the B line if you want a future extension, and you're in an extremely busy and pretty wealthy area that will probably riot when it comes to street closures. I should know, I live in this area. But that also kind of makes it perfect in a way. If we can do it here first, in a wealthy, dense area, that proves we can do it anywhere. So I started futzing around. I realized that logistically, not only was this actually not bad, it was actually pretty good. And, even better, the impacts wouldn't be nearly as bad as I first expected. In most places, you can keep 2 travel lanes open in each direction on streets during almost all of construction. And as I dug into it more and more, pun mildly intended, I got more and more excited about it. And then I started researching and talking to experts to make sure I wasn't totally off my rocker. So here it is, my proposal. Do you want Crenshaw North a decade or more sooner and way cheaper? This is how we get there. Cut and cover for phases 2 and 3 of LA Metro's K-Line Northern Extension. Let's start at the end of phase 1, shall we? We have this extremely deep K-Line station under the D-Line's Wilshire-Fairfax station box. It adds a crossover at that depth, insanely expensive, but it would be necessary at the end of a phase, along with boring tail tracks at the end so that the trains can use that crossover. So we begin with the need to bring these tracks at about 105 feet depth to something like 25 feet depth. Now, there's two ways you can do this. One, you can just extend the end of phase 1 to 3rd Street and bore the tunnels up until we're near the surface and extract the tunnel boring machines on the Whole Foods site that Metro is already planning to acquire for this line for staging. Or you can end with phase 1 at the tail tracks and construct the slope cut and cover. I mean, we're already doing a giant cut and cover at the step for Wilshire-Fairfax Station at a greater width, so it's extremely feasible. The question is only which is cheaper. The upside with cut and cover the whole way is I don't think you'd actually need the Whole Foods site at all. The reason Metro has it in their EIR as an acquisition is because of staging, and boring requires much larger staging areas than cut and cover, which leads to one of the first major cost reduction areas for cut and cover. You don't need to acquire these massive, insanely expensive properties for staging and TBM launcher extraction. So because of this, I'm assuming cut and cover all the way would be cheaper. But either way, I'm citing the Fairfax 3rd station further north than the EIR does for 3 reasons. 1, it allows more space to gently slope the tracks upward since we're ending it at a shallower depth. 2, you'll see momentarily that the wider curve in the EIR's version combined with its crossover is what restricts it from moving further north there, and our curve will start later and the crossover is frankly optional. And 3, it will provide easier access to the forthcoming Television City development on the corner of Fairfax and Beverly. So with that in mind, let's look at my potential station plan. Now, I am keeping this as shallow as possible, a single level beneath the street, to make it as cheap as possible. And that means side platform stations. And yes, despite needing more utility relocation, still much cheaper than what we'd spend boring the tunnels, it is very feasible. You do not need mezzanines.
We use mezzanines in America uniquely to a high degree. Our fixation on mezzanines hugely increase costs.
While avoiding mezzanines, we do, of course, still want cross-platform access, and step-free access at that, within the station without needing to cross the road above. So each station will also have 1 or 2 small passages below the tracks to facilitate that, meaning that we're only digging further than one level in these tiny areas rather than the whole area. Side platforms also mean to make sure you don't have to use those cross passages going down and up again to access one platform, you at least want one entrance on either side of the street. So in this case, I'm taking one extra property to enable that, and having the other main entrance of the farmer's market parking lot, which was already an option for the EIR version. These 2 elevators stop at surface level, platform level, and cross passage level, allowing full step-free access at each. I also have 2 further revenue entrances to the north to help facilitate Television City access. These are single stair entrances only, and the current turn lanes on Fairfax, simply meaning that the length of these turn lanes will be shortened. And it's here that I want to discuss just how much simpler this is to build than the EIR version. Look at these respective 3D models of the station. Even with bored tunnels, the stations are built cut and cover, and there's 8 times the volume to excavate in the EIR version than in our cut and cover version. 8 times. So impact-wise, this street will be disrupted for significantly less time in our cut and cover version than the EIR version. Further, crossovers don't need their own station box extensions spanning the width of the street like they do in the EIR's deep bore version, and they can be added almost anywhere in the tunnels, further massively reducing surface disruption. But what about those tunnels? The main downside of cut and cover politically is the street disruption outside of the station areas. Well, our roads in LA tend to be pretty wide. If we take some examples of the various streets we'll be tunneling under, you can see that the tunnels, prior to the point when they'll be decked and the street can be restored, which, because of their shallowness, would happen much faster than the current excavations on, say, Wilshire, only require taking up a relatively small amount of space in the median. In almost every area we'll be tunneling, you can keep 2 lanes open in each direction throughout construction, and maintain all bike lanes and sidewalks and even some parking. The only exceptions are part of Fairfax and part of Santa Monica, where it would be 1 lane in each direction. Add in compensation to the businesses along the way, a pittance compared to the money we'll be saving, and the disruption isn't in the same universe as old-style cut and cover, where you needed to close the whole street. And to really put it into perspective, even though we're excavating along the whole line now, we're still excavating not only less, but far less than in the board version, because of the shallowness of the tunnels and the stations. The station excavation areas for a deep bore design comprise more volume than the entirety of the tunnels and station areas for the cut and cover version. So yes, as weird as it sounds, with a cut and cover line, you're actually cutting and covering less than with a deep bore line. And there's even a benefit I hadn't thought of.
One of the most overlooked benefits of cut and cover is you're basically just doing utility relocation, excavation, and foundation pouring. That's something that a lot of contractors can do. And so what you're able to do is you can really competitively bid out cut and cover work, and you can complete it concurrently instead of sequentially.
That's something I didn't even think about, like the fact that the work is significantly less specialized.
Yeah, you can really parcel out the contracts a lot smaller. The more simple the building method and the smaller you can procure those contracts, the more competitive the procurements get.
That contractor point is huge. We can finally have meaningful competition for contracts again, and split the contracts into smaller portions. So if one contractor is dropping the ball, which happens kind of a lot, it doesn't torpedo the whole schedule. In fact, because we no longer have the need to build tunnels sequentially, we have a lot more flexibility when it comes to where and when we dig, meaning we can optimize for speed, cost, or minimal disruptions as desired. All in all, the disruptions are well within acceptable limits, especially when you factor in the benefits to the area once the line actually opens, and the fact that in restoring streetscapes, we can add street improvements as well. Let's continue north. The 800-foot curve in the EIR version will need to be shortened so we don't have to take all of these properties to dig the tunnel out here. But if we reduce the radius to 520 feet, truly not a big deal in terms of speed reduction, especially as it's near a station where the train needs to slow down anyway, we can reduce the properties required to just these 3. A bank, a gas station, and a small retail building. All told, relatively inexpensive when compared to something like that Whole Foods acquisition. And they're in a prime spot for a metro-led mixed-use development that can earn a lot of money back. Continuing on down Beverly, where we can keep 2 lanes open in each direction throughout construction, we get to Beverly La Cienega Station. I believe we no longer need these 3 properties, saving more money, and in return would only need a small slice of this parking lot. Here we have a simple station with the main entrances at the west and emergency-only exits emptying out under the sidewalks to the east. We'll then turn onto San Vicente and follow its curves, or if preferred, we could straighten it out if we didn't mind the expense of acquiring these properties. Either way, we turn on to the already planned acquisition of the Sheriff's Department for the San Vicente station, keeping it entirely off-street for minimal disruption and removing the need to acquire this property here. Because this is under acquired land and not the street, this could be either center or a side platform. Center's simpler, you just need to widen the space between the tracks on either side, so it would depend on how that trade-off pans out. Either way, you can easily have revenue entrances to the north and south. Worth mentioning that under San Vicente, you can keep 2 travel lanes in each direction and the bike lanes in each direction, and do the same on this upcoming section of Santa Monica. Also worth noting, none of the curves here or anywhere on the cut and cover version are tighter than 400 feet radii. As a comparison, the E and A lines have some slow curves that are closer to 200-foot radii. Next, we come to another huge benefit for WeHo. The cost savings could allow us to add back in the Santa Monica La Cienega station that got axed early on. With one of our 2 revenue entrances at the park, the only property required here would be this small parking lot, with the western exits being emergency only. Under the narrow section of Santa Monica, we get to the heaviest car impacts down to one lane in each direction during peak construction, but businesses can be mollified by retaining parking. And again, that closure won't last nearly as long as it would for our current D-line station construction road closures, due to the narrowness and shallowness of the tunnels. Here, in any given slice of the tunnel, you're excavating less than a sixth of the area of one of those deep bore stations, and can put on that decking that allows for full street restoration much faster. Santa Monica Fairfax would require the same buildings that one of the options does, but not the entire massive Whole Foods complex that the other option does. Man, the EIR really hates Whole Foods on Fairfax, doesn't it? It instead would just need a tiny slice of the Whole Foods parking lot. Again, here we have our main revenue entrances on one side of the station and emergency-only exits onto sidewalks on the other side. Although, if the width of the sidewalks is enough adjacent to those entrances, you could make them revenue entrances too. Not necessary, though. Moving on to Santa Monica La Brea, here we see massive cost savings. All of these properties are taken in the EIR for staging and TBM launch. In my version, though, all you need is this cheaper property here and one small part of the parking lot here. I also add second revenue entrances to the west side. The northern one onto the westbound platform sits under the sidewalk and street and just requires a few street parking spaces. And the other one would need the retail center on the corner to play ball to cut it into the plaza, and there may be part of the parking garage under there, I'm not sure. But either way, it isn't necessary if not doable. Now we get to the biggest curve radius reduction, from a 1,000-foot radius curve onto Highland shortened to a 400-foot radius curve. This means the only required building here would be the public storage facility, which again represents another good redevelopment opportunity for Metro, as this area is really building up. On Highland, continuing north, you can keep 2 lanes open in each direction during construction, and then we come to probably the most complicated section here, and the biggest constraint on building these 2 phases cut and cover: Hollywood and Highland Station. So you can see the EIR has a comically massive station box, accommodating high-speed crossovers on each side, extremely deep, so it can pass beneath the Hollywood and Highland B-line station box, just as it does at Wilshire Fairfax with the D-line. This makes the volume that needs to be excavated insane. I mean, seriously, insane. You also need all of these properties, or all of these in the second option, with the northernmost one being required for TBM extraction. Instead, this cut and cover version is predicated on the idea that we can actually build above the B-line station. Now, if you wanted to end the line here, you don't technically have to do this. In fact, early alternatives for the K-line northern extension did just that, emphatically stopping the line here with no possibility of extension to not have to deal with crossing the B-line. And if that was the only way to construct this cut and cover, honestly, it might be worth it. But thankfully, it's not. The B-line station box is about 24 feet underground at its shallowest point. That is just deep enough that you could thread the K-line over the B-line station box rather than under. Now, it would be way easier due to the available parking lots for entrances and the existence of knockout panels on either side to site the K-line wholly to the south of the B-line and only have the tracks need to cross above the B-line station box. Unfortunately, the ground slopes downward on that side, and you obviously can't build the station on a slope. So that means the K-line needs to be built mostly to the north of the B-line, with just a small bit peeking out to the south to access that knockout panel opposite of the current entrance. I'm pretty sure to use these knockout panels, you need to take the adjacent properties, since they're basically at the edge of the street. So we'll leave the ghost mezzanine unused and just take this property, like the EIR requires, and build a second main entrance to the station on this side of the street. That would leave just enough room under the sidewalk for vertical circulation up to the K-line northbound platform, with a passage built above the B-line station box here. Problem is, we still don't have direct access to the northbound platform from the street, requiring you to go down and up again. So we're going to take one further cheap property here with an emergency-only exit opposite it alongside Ovation Hollywood on the sidewalk. But this elevator and this elevator here exist to move passengers between platform and the cross passage / mezzanine levels, so there's still convenient step-free access to both platforms from each entrance without having to schlep all the way across the station. These two elevators, meanwhile, will stop on the surface, K platform level, and the B mezzanine/cross passage level. Connections between the K and B lines can easily be made with these pathways. Meanwhile, we no longer need these 5 properties, again leading to a massive net reduction in properties required. Now, you could end the line here with tail tracks, like the EIR version will frankly have to, as a deep Hollywood Bowl station would require eye-poppingly expensive SEM construction that just wouldn't be cost-effective. But I think our cut-and-cover version could do it relatively inexpensively, as long as we're not encountering that hard rock that's causing problems at the shallow depths where we'll remain. So we curve with Highland on 400-foot curves, remaining level at first as the street rises to allow for the required allowance for fault rupture displacement as we cross the Hollywood Fault. Then we rise with the street up to the Hollywood Bowl. Now, there's an existing pedestrian tunnel here that connects to either side of Highland, as well as the bus yard in the middle that is heavily used during bull shows. We're going to conveniently make use of this tunnel and expand it. Well, dig out and reconstruct it, really, as sort of a mezzanine level, because we want to have the end of the line here set up for the ability to one day be extended to the valley, which will have to happen with tunnel boring. To cross the 101, it'll have to be deeper than its foundations, but that still would make the tracks considerably deeper than is ideal for the terminus here. But I think we can keep the tracks a little bit shallower and allow space for a TBM pit here at the end, after which the tracks in a future phase would immediately turn to follow under Highland so they can dive deeper before crossing the 101. Meanwhile, our station, without tail tracks, will want to be designed similar to downtown Santa Monica, with 2 platforms and a pocket turnback track, and some sort of crossover on this end. I mean, I'm sure this one is messed up enough that any real engineer will scream, but that's not the point. In the future, only the 2 outside tracks would continue to the valley, allowing the pocket track to still function as a turnback track if you want to run double frequency south of here for events or any other reason. And having 2 full-size platforms will accommodate the crush capacity that will be required for events. And keeping this pocket track terminated here allows for platform-level circulation between the 2, and using an expanded passage with added step-free access and escalator access here, as the station entrance/mezzanine allows for a single point of access to both platforms and to the bus yard overhead, moving the current staircase to over here and adding an escalator and elevator access. So we achieve a bull station that can A, operate effectively as a terminus, B, easily allow for a future extension, and C, accommodate event crush capacity, a full 70 feet shallower, not to mention considerably shorter, than the SEM constructed station in the EIR, a depth where hopefully the rock is much less of an issue. You can see that we've barely touched the overall alignment at all, besides adding tighter curves and adding back the possibility of 2 more stations at Santa Monica, La Cienega, and the Bull. And any travel time costs caused by the speed reductions there would be paid back in full by the fact that riders would only need to descend a single level to reach the platforms at all stations except for the Bull, massively reducing the time spent on stairs, escalators, or elevators to reach the platforms in the bored EIR version of the line. Now, let's talk cost. Phases 2 and 3 in the EIR, using bored tunnels and absent stations of the Bull and Santa Monica La Cienega, are coming in at $10.14 billion, or an eye-popping $1.72 billion per mile, including stations. According to Alon Levy, the most recent example of modern cut-and-cover construction is Paris's Line 13, which came in at around $209 million per mile in 2021 dollars. In 2025 dollars, that rounds up close to $250 million, and let's literally triple that amount because, American transit construction, to $750 million per mile, and assume that that would be a pretty reasonable assumption of where this would land. That leaves us with a total cost, excluding the Bull and Santa Monica La Cienega, of $4.44 billion for phases 2 and 3, only 43.7% of the current price, and saving a whopping $5.7 billion. You know what those cost savings would allow? Well, let's go back to my chart from the previous K-Line video on the costs of the line, along with what Measure M provides starting in 2041, and what the EIFD study suggested that the EIFDs from WeHo and LA City and County would be able to raise to accelerate it. Now, we're still going to assume federal matching dollars would come in because this would be post-2028, and I'm not ready to write off the country just yet. And massively reduced costs without reducing ridership would make this insanely cost-effective and as competitive as it could be for any available federal grants. Even if we assume Phase 1 stays the same cost, and it can get much cheaper by eliminating the unnecessary crossovers at Midtown Crossing and Crenshaw Adams, it eats up $2.33 billion of LA County City EIFT money to be able to provide that local half of the cost entirely without the Measure M money and start sooner. Meanwhile, Phases 2 and 3 considered together now cost so much less that the only local contribution necessary would be $2.22 billion instead of $5.07 billion. You know how much they said a WeHo EIFT would bring in? $2.2 billion. And you still have leftover LA City and County EIFT money to use as well. And you know how much Measure M has slated for K North starting in 2041? $2.23 billion. Well, isn't that just about the most convenient thing there is? You can literally divorce the entire project from Measure M's schedule, building it as quickly as you can get shovels into the ground, and even use the Measure M funds to entirely pay back WeHo in 2041, or partly to fund the additional Bull and Santa Monica La Cienega stations that would still be way cheaper than that. We could even afford to add in relatively cheap junction boxes that would allow us to keep the Santa Monica line dream alive. This takes us from a horrifically unaffordable project where we best case have to wait until 2050 for a complete opening of all phases, to one that could open entirely by 2040, hamstrung mainly by the 10 to 12 years that Phase 1 would take. Again, it takes much longer to construct the line as a deep bore than it would as cut and cover. There's plenty of time to redesign Phases 2 and 3 as cut and cover while moving on Phase 1 construction, and then starting 2 and 3 construction concurrently with Phase 1. I don't want to be hyperbolic, but this is literally the silver bullet to getting this line soon. The full line, in just 15 years rather than 25 best case or 35 years more likely. And for the record, it might be possible to construct either half or all of Phase 1 cut and cover, though the northern and southern halves each have one big question mark, and this would slow the line down a bit more meaningfully. The upside is that the TBMs for Phase 1 are all launched from Midtown Crossing, 2 going north and 2 south, so eliminating either half eliminates a TBM launch and saves a lot of money. For the northern half, the median of San Vicente is huge, seemingly ideal for cut and cover. The 2 limiting factors will be A, that you need to reduce the curve to Fairfax from 2 4,400 and 3,000 foot curves to a 400 foot curve, an up to 11-fold decrease, and even then have to shift the line into the outer lanes to do it, making it travel a bit more of a circuitous route and adding some travel time to the line, and B, that you only have 20 feet of clearance above the D-line station box instead of the 24 feet with the B-line. Maybe that's possible, but it's threading the needle really thin, inches to spare if anything at all. But if you could fit tracks over the D-line station box and don't mind a slightly longer ride, it would save gobs more money by not needing that second TBM launch at all, and not needing to dig so ridiculously deep for Wilshire Fairfax. And the time spent restudying it could be gained back in faster construction time. What about the southern half? I actually thought that you straight up couldn't do Phase 1 south of Midtown Crossing cut and cover at all because of the need to cross the 10. But actually, if you bring the tracks at grade to cross on the existing bridge, there is, if my math is right, just enough space on either end of the bridge with the way the ground slopes to get the tracks back to the Metro standard depth for cut and cover on a 5% grade before encroaching on the intersections. There's enough room that you could keep 2 travel lanes open in each direction on Crenshaw, but you're restricting the ramps from being accessed by the opposite side of the road, so you're losing these possible travel paths in red, and you probably need to grab this property for a turn lane onto this ramp, and this one for turn lanes onto Adams. The feasibility question on this is whether the existing bridge is rated to carry light rail, or if it'd have to be torn down and rebuilt, which, over an active freeway, would not be cheap. And of course, you're again adding travel time by taking a much longer, less direct route, with the tightest turn of the whole line at 300-foot radius here. And notably, you do no longer go under Lafayette Square at all, though I actually consider that a negative, as there's no objective reason to not tunnel into residential areas, and we cannot let them make that a precedent, because that's insane. But if the Thames Bridge can hold the line unmodified, and the clearance over the D-line is enough, there's no longer any need to bore in the K-line northern extension, and you'd save roughly an additional $1.4 billion. But even if you can't do either part of Phase 1, Phases 2 and 3 are enough. When it comes to pushback, I expect it to come from 3 places. First, from the handful of massive contractors that are currently the only entities able to deliver complex underground metro lines, as this would effectively remove our dependence on them for these phases and lose them a lot of premium work, while us taxpayers would have the benefit of much more competitive bids. 2, the usual crowd of NIMBYs that will lose their absolute shit at any suggestion of surface disruption for their cars. But this will cause significantly less surface disruption at station areas, and the disruption elsewhere can be very effectively mitigated by keeping multiple lanes open during construction, along with some parking, and allowing for extremely reduced timelines due to the shallow depth of the line and the ability to restore streets once the decking is up. And as I am directly in the affected area, I can at least be a voice to counter them, because I find those disruptions extremely worth it. And given how much WeHo wants this line, I think much of the area will agree with me. But there's also 3, Metro staff who would likely be very unwilling to open this whole can of worms and change the way they've been doing things forever. I'm a huge proponent of building state capacity and moving work in-house, but I also have to acknowledge the fact that there's a lot of institutional sluggishness in a lot of government agencies, including Metro right now, that often require a politician running with a specific platform and getting a mandate for reform to meaningfully alter things. Right now, the best chances we have of altering the standard of how Metro designs lines is via the Sepulveda P3 with Bechtel's automated heavy rail concept. But with something like this, it might require the Metro board deciding it's worth it to push Metro staff to consider this. But that is possible. There is a lot of appetite to deliver this line and to deliver it as soon as possible, which is great news. And, to me at least, it's frankly difficult to see a change to cut and cover as anything other than a positive. There's understandable fear that introducing any new change or volatility to the project risks pushing it back, but we can't let that freeze us out from potentially saving over $5 or $6 billion and delivering a much better line for riders, because there's a very strong chance this would accelerate completion and by a lot. I've put this proposal out there, and we'll see where it goes, but I have some guarded optimism about it. It's likely that nothing would get moving until after an alignment is selected, because that needs to happen ASAP to get the ball rolling on EIFDs, and that's why I only bothered examining this as the hybrid alignment, because that's highly likely to be the alignment chosen. But when the alignment is chosen, hopefully this fall or winter, that will be a good time to start pushing for these changes. Finally, I want to acknowledge that a lot of people over the years have asked me about starting up a Patreon. I've honestly never felt comfortable with it, because more money isn't going to increase the pace of videos. That's dependent on my work and home life schedules, and I love my job and won't stop doing it. Besides, there's many things out there that deserve your support more than me. That said, it did give me the idea of a good way to help the community through these videos. So in lieu of a Patreon, what I want to do is spend a minute at the end of each video talking about a different organization in LA doing incredible work that could use your support, certainly more than myself. And I can't think of a bigger issue right now in July of 2025 than our neighbors being kidnapped off the street and disappeared by a secret police, one that this administration just robbed Medicare and Medicaid to give a budget larger than any law enforcement agency in US history, and who are already building what are definitionally concentration camps. Even just saying those words feels insane, but that's where we are right now. One vital organization providing resources for immigrants is the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights, or CHIRLA. They're on the front lines of the fight against ICE, providing critical legal services, locating those kidnapped, and shedding daylight on the horrific human rights abuses in ICE detention centers. LA's been showing up with incredible solidarity and humanity since these ICE raids ramped up, and if you want to help but aren't sure how, this is a fantastic way to do it. I know there's also a lot of mutual aid happening for local street vendors to help them stay afloat without risking themselves on the street. So if you find a good opportunity to contribute there in your neighborhood, that's a very direct way to help as well. It's a tough time in LA right now, but I'm also very proud of the city for standing up for each other. So keep it up, LA.